Chapter 6. First-order effects of race differences in crime. Race differences in crime rates have different effects in different places. In big cities, race differences in crime rates have broad effects on the social structure and functioning of the city, and on policing in particular. In towns and small cities, those effects are much less pronounced and sometimes non-existent. Effects in big city America. Race differences in crime have more effects in big cities than in towns and small cities because all of them have a part of town where each of the two races with higher crime rates is residentially concentrated. Among the 52 places I defined in Chapter 2 as big city America, with 500,000 people or more in a contiguous urban area, even the smallest African population, 15,600 in Albuquerque, and the smallest Latin population, 17,100 in Pittsburgh, are large enough to form distinctly African or Latin neighborhoods, though in comparatively small parts of town. In 2019, the median number of Africans in the 52 big cities was 226,500, and the median number of Latins was 173,900. Enough to create African and Latin parts of town so large that they have their own shopping and entertainment districts. The poorest neighborhoods within them, which also tend to be the ones with the highest crime rates, are called the inner city. The nation's capital provides a classic example of the result. Figure 2 in the insert shows the zip codes of the District of Columbia and their socioeconomic status, SES. The top number is the zip code. The bottom number is the zip code's percentile on an index that combines the zip code's median family income and the percentage of adults in that zip code with at least a college degree. Percentiles have been rounded to the nearest whole number. Thus, the 5 zip codes with index scores of 100 are in the top half of the 99th percentile relative to the rest of the population of the United States. Of all the arrests for violent crimes from 2013 to 2019, 56% occurred in the 4 zip codes colored red. Another 30% of them occurred in the 6 codes colored orange. That leaves just 14% to be divided among all the zip codes colored blue. A large swath of Washington, with the highest socioeconomic status, experienced just 5% of the arrests. The insulation of Washington's elites from violent crime is even greater than the map indicates. 3 of the orange zip codes are partially gentrified. Zip code 20,003 includes Capitol Hill. The zip code as a whole is in the 99th percentile of SES despite having a large low-income population in its eastern half. A microanalysis of the geocodes reveals that the bulk of the arrests occurred in the eastern half of zip code 20,003. The same is true of zip codes 20,001 and 20,009. The zip codes managed to have such high SES rankings despite being divided into affluent and low-income neighborhoods. Most of the arrests that caused the zip codes to be colored orange occurred in the ungentrified parts. I use Washington as the example, perhaps partly because I lived in zip codes 20,003 and 20,009 for a total of 9 years, but the pattern applies to New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago as well. That pattern, a high concentration of crime in the poorest part of town, creates a variety of effects on economic activity. In big city America, disproportionate minority crime rates cause Europeans and Asians to avoid going into minority neighborhoods. Crime rates and socioeconomic status both vary widely across zip codes in minority neighborhoods in big city America. These areas contain middle-class zip codes and impoverished ones, zip codes with low crime rates and others with high crime rates. But that makes no difference to the perception held by most Europeans and Asians. Unfamiliar with these variations, they typically see the entire minority part of town as potentially dangerous. It's not a matter of simple racism. The same Europeans and Asians who avoid going to the minority part of town may have minority colleagues at work with whom they get along fine. They may have minority neighbors with whom they are friends, but they won't go to the minority part of town to shop, stay at a hotel, buy a car, or send their children to school. They don't drive into it unless it is the shortest route to some place they need to go. They also won't buy a home in the minority part of town unless they are pioneers initiating gentrification or are taking advantage of gentrification that is already well underway. But it would be a mistake to think they are deterred only because of crime. Widespread and voluntary residential segregation by race seems to be a fact of life around the world. No matter what the races are or what the country's economic and political system is. In discussing the effects of crime, I am referring specifically to economic effects. In big city America, disproportionate minority crime rates deter developers from building office space in minority neighborhoods unless gentrification is already well underway. Real estate is typically cheaper in African or Latin parts of town than elsewhere, a factor that would ordinarily attract developers to build office space for law firms, doctors' offices, and other businesses that would like to escape the high rentals in the European midtown. But unless it is clear that the neighborhood is near a gentrification tipping point, those lucrative rentals won't happen, and so the office buildings don't get built. In big city America, disproportionate minority crime rates raise the costs of doing business for retailers of all kinds. It is often alleged that large commercial chains avoid putting stores in minority neighborhoods. The empirical part of the allegation is sometimes true, but the inference that racism is to blame does not follow. Shoplifting is far more common in many big city minority neighborhoods than elsewhere. It often doesn't make economic sense for big chain stores, which have business models based on low profit margins, to locate in such neighborhoods. Either they won't make a profit, or they will have to charge higher prices, leaving themselves open to accusations of racist price gouging. If they take measures to apprehend shoplifters, they risk charges of racism and financial shakedowns through the threat of lawsuits. Actions taken to prevent shoplifting can also put employees at risk of violent confrontations. It's a no-win situation. Opening a store in a big city minority neighborhood is often not economically rational. Racism need not have anything to do with the decision. Meanwhile, the small locally owned retailers in a big city minority neighborhood also have a hard time making a profit because of shoplifting, the threat of robbery, high insurance costs, and banks' reluctance to make high-risk loans. The locally owned stores tend to be poorly stocked, with few amenities, and overpriced relative to stores selling the same goods elsewhere. Effects on policy interventions. The problems of America's inner cities have preoccupied policy analysts for 50 years. Many reforms have been proposed, and many attempts at implementing them have received generous government funding. The dismal record of those efforts has been widely recognized by policy scholars across the political spectrum. Their failures have been intimately linked with the high crime rates in the neighborhoods where the efforts have been undertaken. High minority crime rates make many policy solutions inherently unrealistic. Among the reasons that inner-city reform programs have so consistently failed is that the desired objective is directly impeded by the existence of high crime. Raj Chetty of Harvard and his colleagues have conducted extremely detailed geographic analyses of upward socioeconomic mobility down to the level of city blocks. They have been able to identify certain characteristics of neighborhoods that matter. One is a low level of racial bias among local Europeans, and another is a high level of social interaction across racial groups. But neighborhoods with high minority crime rates are intrinsically places where racial bias among local Europeans will be high, and where social interaction across racial groups will be low. No government program can change that. Other social interventions for helping inner-city children and adolescents come up against similar inherent problems. Preschool for toddlers, mentoring for young men without fathers, educational enrichment, counseling services. All of these have a chance of making a contribution if they are implemented in neighborhoods where they are reinforced by large numbers of functional two-parent families. But African and Latin parents in such families have exactly the same priority as those in functional two-parent European and Asian families. Do everything possible to find a safe place to raise their children. The result is that most of them have left high-crime areas for other neighborhoods and that the sponsors of the interventions do not have large numbers of functional two-parent families to reinforce their efforts. The places where the need for social interventions is greatest are the places where they have the least chance of working. High crime is a big part of the reason. Attempts to stimulate economic growth in places with high crime rates work only in places that are gentrifying or can be gentrified. Over the decades since the 1960s, federal and municipal governments have periodically introduced programs that offer economic incentives for businesses to invest in the inner city. The most recent example consists of the opportunity zones enacted as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. The act offers capital gains tax breaks for investments in about 8,700 designated opportunity zones, supposedly in disadvantaged areas. It is reported that some of them aren't, with the intention of spurring economic growth and job creation. The academic analyses of the results so far suggest that this initiative is producing the same unintended outcomes that have characterized previous efforts. Some of these results are endemic to government programs intended to help the disadvantaged. The process is captured by politicians, lawyers, consultants, and lobbyists who successfully game the rules. But attempts to stimulate economic growth in the inner city are vulnerable to a specific, built-in opportunity for exploitation. The land occupied by the inner city really is potentially worth a lot of money if, but only if, the minority residents are replaced through gentrification. Thus, big cities throughout the country have seen neighborhoods that were notorious centers of crime, drugs, and desperate poverty become fashionable, high-priced parts of town through gentrification. Property values soared. So did the availability of jobs. But this was of scant benefit to those who had lived there, few of whom had been owners of that newly valuable property, and few of whom filled the new jobs. Each new attempt to revitalize inner cities for the people who already live there has run up against this built-in obstacle. In the case of the opportunity zones, the capital gains tax benefits have led to increased property values for vacant lots and property designated for redevelopment. But because of the monetary value of the tax benefit and the longer-term prospect of gentrification, the value of the shop next to the vacant lot has not increased, nor will the shop be hiring any more employees, because there has been no change in the economic attractiveness of that part of the city. A major reason is crime, effects on policing. The American criminal justice system needs reform on many fronts. Inconsistencies in sentencing, including racial injustices, are a problem. Uneven enforcement of drug laws is a problem. Overuse of imprisonment is a problem. The militarization of the police is a problem. Wrong and sometimes criminal behavior by police is a problem. Nothing that follows is intended to minimize those problems or to deny that racism still exists within the criminal justice system. Rather, I want to introduce some realism about what we can expect from normal, well-meaning human beings, trying to behave professionally and appropriately in an environment of large race differences and violent criminality. The job of a police patrol officer, a cop, in an urban setting is unique. Many occupations involve close personal interactions with a wide variety of people. Many occupations have broadly defined goals and flexible rules, giving the worker wide discretion. A small number of occupations require decisions on matters of the utmost importance, including life and death. A still smaller number of occupations require that decisions sometimes be made within seconds. Only a handful of occupations are intrinsically dangerous. The job of an urban police patrol officer is unique in combining all of those attributes. Any or all can be brought into play on any given shift. This is especially true of physical danger. Being a logger or a firefighter carries intrinsic physical risks, but only two ways of making a lawful living are intrinsically dangerous because other human beings may deliberately assault or kill you: being a member of a combat unit in the military or being a police officer. The way the police officer's job looks to the outside world and the way it looks to the police are radically different. I spent all of Chapter 4 discussing a handful of the most serious crimes, but enforcement of the laws against the index crimes takes up only a tiny fraction of a patrol officer's time. Most of a cop's time and energy are spent on maintaining order. Disorder, the thing the police are supposed to fix, can be an obnoxious drunk, a homeless man berating passers-by, teenagers blocking a sidewalk, a bar fight, a man pushing a woman around, someone dealing crystal meth, or a robber holding up a convenience store. Depending on the situation, the professionally correct police response spans the range from, "Why don't you tell me your side of the story?" to drawing a loaded weapon and firing it at a citizen. That description doesn't begin to convey the range, complexity, and ambiguity of the situations that big city police face all the time. Describing them adequately has been the topic of thick books. My point is that the environment in which cops work necessarily has an impact on the choices they make. As an empirical matter, a cop who politely suggests go home and sober up to a middle-class 45-year-old man on a suburban street who has had too much to drink has reason to be confident that whether the response is meek or belligerent, it will pose no serious physical danger. A 20-year-old male of any race in a high-crime neighborhood who has gotten equally drunk with some other 20-year-olds will probably acquiesce non-violently, but there is a non-trivial chance that he or one of his friends will respond with a weapon. There is a non-trivial chance that the young males are not in an alcoholic stupor but strung out on ecstasy. Police in such situations are less confident that a polite request to go home will have the desired effect. The course they choose will reflect their need to protect against the possibility of a violent response. Now think in terms of frequency distributions of the amount of force that police use. For every situation that a cop faces, let us say there is an optimal choice, as defined in the police training manuals or perhaps by an omniscient observer. As the environment in which police are working becomes more dangerous, that optimal choice moves along the distribution toward the use more force and defensive precautions tail of the bell curve. One result is that well-trained police exercising good judgment will, on average, take more steps to establish their authority, call for more backup, and respond with more force to provocations in high-crime parts of town than in low-crime areas, regardless of the race of the citizens they are dealing with. Another result is that errors in judgment will be skewed toward the greater force end of the distribution. If the error in the direction of greater force is perceived as reducing the downside risk, and the downside risk is one's own death, then police officers, being human, will err on the side of protecting themselves. Added to that human reaction is the mental stress associated with combat, stress unlike anything that most of us, including me, have ever experienced. The physiological effects of the adrenaline surge are powerful, and they are in addition to the psychological effects of fear and anger. All of these factors mean that police use of force, including excessive use of force, will always and inevitably be higher in high-crime areas than in low-crime areas. And high-crime areas in the United States are overwhelmingly urban and African or Latin. These observations do not excuse the examples caught on video of police willfully harassing or physically mistreating African or Latin citizens. Police who do such things should be kicked off the force and shunned by other police departments. The problem is that those videos go viral, watched by millions. Those same millions do not see video from police body cameras showing the thousands of daily instances when police continue to be polite in the face of obscenities screamed at them, expose themselves to risk rather than overreact to a threat, or make extraordinary efforts to help someone who is injured or in danger. What about the most outrageous and the most viral of all the videos, the ones that show police killing defenseless suspects? Those police are guilty of criminal acts that deserve the severest punishment. But to conflate them with errors and decisions that had to be made in seconds in the face of lethal threats is a libel on police. They deserve better of the people they serve. Effects in small city America. I have argued elsewhere that the differences between big city America and everywhere else are the real cultural fault line that has polarized the nation. Life in big city America is different on almost every dimension from life in rural, small town, and small city America. That is as true of the effects of race differences in crime rates as it is of everything else. I will operationally define small city America as standalone places of fewer than 150,000 people. Standalone means that they are not part of one of the 52 big city contiguous urban areas. In all, 170 million people, more than half of the American population, live in small city America. I use the label small city America for convenience, but most of those people live in places that are more like towns than cities. Half of them live in rural areas or towns of less than 25,000, and another 20% of them live in cities of 25,000 to 50,000. Race differences in crime rates in small city America are less important than in big city America. This is true partly because the violent crime rates are usually much lower. In 2017, the mean rate of violent offenses per 100,000 in standalone cities of less than 150,000 population was 333 per 100,000, less than half the mean rate of 679 in cities larger than that. The smaller the crime problem, the less ominous are race differences in crime rates. It's not just that the crime rate is lower in towns and small cities, race relations are likely to be different as well. It is possible for a city of under 150,000 to have a large minority neighborhood if the overall percentage of the minority is high, but that is uncommon. Far more often, the African or Latin neighborhood is small and more socially permeable than a minority neighborhood with tens of thousands of people covering many city blocks. In a town or small city, Europeans, Africans, and Latins are more likely to shop in the same stores and go to the same doctor's offices than in the megalopolises. They may not be more likely to worship together. Apparently, churches still constitute the most racially segregated institution in America, but they are more likely to volunteer for the same community activities and to be members of the same local civic institutions. Perhaps most importantly, the children in small city America are likely to grow up knowing people who don't look like them. If the minority community is small, none of the schools can be segregated in any meaningful sense. Parents of different races will attend the same PTA meetings and sit in the same bleachers for Little League games. About 100 million people who inhabit small city America live in a place that has only one high school. All the high school students, of all races and socioeconomic classes, can be found in the same hallways, classrooms, lunchrooms, and on the same athletic teams. A basic feature of human psychology makes all this relevant to the way that race differences in crime rates are perceived. It is easy to stereotype a race or any other kind of identifiable group if you do not actually know members of that group. Intimate friendships aren't required. Just acquaintance and regular interaction go a long way toward diffusing the stereotype. When it comes to crime rates, the typical experience of Europeans in small city America is to have encountered and gotten to know at least several members of a given minority over the years. Statistically, odds are that none of them is any scarier than the European is. It's one thing to be aware in the abstract that only a small proportion of the members of any race are violent or criminal. It's a much different thing to know from experience that only a small proportion, usually zero, of the members of a given minority that you know personally are violent or criminal. These general characteristics of towns and small cities play out somewhat differently in different parts of small city America. European small city America. Almost 67 million Americans live in rural areas, towns, or cities of under 150,000, where at least 85% of the local population is European. In these places, the violent crime rate using 2017 data is 58 per 100,000, 1/6 of the national average. Another 33 million Americans live in places where 75 to 84% of the population is European. Their average violent crime rate is 126 per 100,000, a third of the national average. These crime rates are too low to make race an issue in how these communities function on any dimension, no matter what the ratio of African European or Latin European crime rates might be. That's a total of 100 million Americans for whom race differences in crime rates are irrelevant to their daily lives. African small city America. To qualify as a part of African small city America requires that Africans be at least 25% of the population and also be the largest minority in the town or city. 16 million Americans live in places meeting that definition. Overall, 42% of the population of African small city America is African. The violent crime rate in those places averages 401 per 100,000. While that rate is just slightly above the national average, it is so much higher than crime rates in the rest of small city America that it is likely to reflect a higher crime rate in the African population. If so, the effects of race differences in crime that apply to large cities could apply to small ones, particularly those of the 100,000 to 150,000 range. In the smaller cities and towns, the general considerations I discussed earlier would mitigate those effects. Latin small city America. To qualify as a part of Latin small city America requires that Latins be at least 25% of the population and also be the largest minority in the town or city, a definition that includes almost 20 million Americans. In Latin small city America, 47% of the population is Latin. The violent crime rate averages 231 per 100,000, which is 59% of the national rate. This suggests that Latin crime rates are only modestly higher than European rates in small city America. It's not necessarily true. Mathematically, the crime rates in these towns and cities could be produced by very low European and Asian rates combined with a high Latin crime rate. But the two small cities with significant Latin populations among the 13 I discussed in Chapter 4, Fort Lauderdale and Urbana, had Latin European violent arrest ratios of just 1.3 and 1.2 respectively. This is consistent with the proposition that disproportionate Latin crime is usually a significant problem only in large cities. It will be important good news if this is confirmed by more city-level crime data by race. Perhaps I have gone too far in minimizing the effects of race differences in crime in small city America. The mitigating circumstances I have described are real, but as soon as a minority neighborhood becomes numerically and spatially large, the kind of effects that I described for big city America are likely to kick in. Nonetheless, I think it is important to keep the distinction between big city and small city America in mind. Overall, the economic and social effects of race differences in crime are far greater in the former than in the latter. Summing up, toward the end of his career, James Q. Wilson, who for decades was one of America's leading scholars of crime and policing, captured the essence of the problem posed by race and crime better than I can. His words are worth quoting at length. A central problem, perhaps the central problem, in improving the relationship between white and black Americans is the difference in racial crime rates. No matter how innocent or guilty a stranger may be, he carries with him in public the burdens or benefits of his group identity.
When whites walk down the street, they are more nervous when they encounter a black man than when they encounter a white one. When blacks walk down the street, they are more likely than whites to be stopped and questioned by a police officer.
It is important, of course, for whites to know that a chance encounter with a black creates little risk, and for police officers to know that they should have more criteria than just skin color to decide who is worth questioning. Many whites and many police officers know this, but in spite of what people know, the racial tension persists. Countless white pedestrians have been worried by the sight of a young black male, and countless innocent black men have had their cars stopped or their walk interrupted by a suspicious cop. White pedestrians may be embarrassed by their own caution. Certainly black pedestrians are upset by unwarranted police intrusions. Whites are fearful of living amid large numbers of blacks and of sending their children to predominantly black schools. Blacks interpret the way they are treated on the streets by white strangers and by police officers as a sign that they can never make much social progress. No matter what I do, I can never be regarded as innocent, many embittered black men will say. I cannot hail a cab as easily as a white, and I will be stopped and questioned by the police more than any white. Integration is a joke. Every statement in that passage is as factually correct today as when Wilson wrote it in 2000. There is no reason to think they will stop being factually correct in the foreseeable future. The problem of race and crime requires us to accept two truths at the same time. In any random encounter between two individuals of different races, whatever those races may be, the chance of any sort of violence is so small that any race differences in the probabilities of violence can be ignored. The differences in the group rates of violence are real and large, and it is human nature, not racism, to take precautions accordingly.